All right, all right, all right.
Hello, hello.
Thanks for joining us today. We're at part 2 of our brand new streaming series to talk about our new classes.
Managing Living Soil Systems Part 2. So in this class, we'll be learning about the foundational principles for soil chemistry, how to read and interpret a soil report, and also how to actually balance a soil, some of the safe application rates, as well as making sure that everything we do when we balance and apply minerals is microbe friendly. We work so hard to make sure that that microbial team is in place for you and working and making those minerals available. We don't want to do anything that can disrupt that. So that's what the goal of this class is, or at least some of them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Oops, there we go.
sorry, technical difficulties.
It's a lot going on up here. We're getting it. We'll get it dialed though.
All right, so we have some live events that we want to announce. Upcoming events, we've decided to start doing a very regular show called Science Bro. And this show is dedicated to science and breaking down research papers, talking about some of the case studies that we have worked on. And I was watching a interesting movie last night talking about science as well, and females in science, but they had a quote in there that I thought was really important and poignant, especially for our times, is that science is still a human endeavor, and so it is subject to our brilliance, but it's also subject to our biases. So that's kind of the point of the classes, or this particular live stream, is just to kind of go over some of those things and break it down. Mm-hmm. So, and then
with the goal to bring people up to speed on how to interpret scientific papers.
Yes.
Right. It's all about empowerment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Discernment.
Yep.
Yep. Very important in these days.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And then the next live event will be Saturday on the 29th of this month, again at noon, and we'll be talking more in depth about the Crescive method class, MasterClass, basic training. And that one will go a little bit more in depth on some of these case studies that we're talking about. And we will also likely go live on some microbes under the microscope. So tune in for that one. That's on Saturday on the 29th at noon. Mm-hmm. And then we have another Sunday session live on the 30th, again at noon, talking more in depth on soil balancing and specifically about the masterclass as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to go deeper into some of the soil reports that I see, and we're going to go through an exercise of balancing commonly found soil issues. So tune into that one.
Yeah. And then again, Wednesday, that's going to be a recurring theme. On February 2nd at 7 p.m., another episode of Science Bro.
Science, bro.
So for the soil balancing for living soil, the second part of our managing living soil systems, we want to make sure that you all know that this class is geared toward live instruction. So it's instruction, everything that you need to know in order to balance living soil at the mineral component, and live Q&A, so you'll really be able to get your questions answered and jump in. You'll have access to a soil calculator for easy math for you, so you can actually do this, and some more analytical tools, as well as an online private forum, so discussion about all that you're learning, and then see what everybody else is learning as a community. We just learn more in depth from each other when we do that. So anyway.
Yep. Yeah, and we want you to have access to the forum to ask questions, because even as a professional, it took me a good 6 months before I even crossed paths with most of the problems that you'll see and need to adjust and balance in soil chemistry. And we wanted to make the class accessible, so the live instruction is 5 sessions, but then you have access to ask questions and commune with your peers for an entire year, as well as have access to the soil calculator and analytical tools, which is exactly my tools. I've literally taken the tools that I've created for myself to do soil analysis as a professional, to provide guidance to farms, and I've turned those into easy-to-use calculator tools that will be available to all the students.
Yeah. And so these are the 3 classes in the Managing Living Soil Systems. Part 1 is the Crescive Method Basic Training, where you learn how to actually implement everything that we're talking about and manage the system as a whole. and gain success from that. And then we dive deeper into the next 2 parts. So the second part, which we're talking about today, is the soil balancing for living soil, all about minerals and chemistry, that part of the system. And then the last class is the microscope masterclass. So that's where if you want to dive even deeper, get a microscope and start learning how to read your soil, what they're telling you more in real time, then you can learn how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's dive into it. Here are some of the key factors that go into what we are calling the Crescive method. So it's very important that you understand what it is that we're trying to achieve here. So it's a lot of analysis and data points that help us guide the system, and we observe what's going on. So the plant and the microbes are telling us what's going on in conjunction with the data sets. And then we're trying to achieve an overall balance in the system of health. So what does that look like? It's life vitality. It's no pests and disease. It's health and vigor and yields and terpene profiles that are in the realm that you want them to be in.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Exactly.
yeah. All right. So what do we mean by balance? Balance is really all of the components that go into a living system that interplay together that create this health that we're talking about.
Sorry, I muted. I keep going. You're good.
Okay. So, so balance before intensity. We always want to get that balance first before we start pushing on the gas pedal. So, and then diversity over singularity. So this comes into play when we're talking about your microbes. Always want the maximum diversity, the complete soil food web over just, say, bacteria or mycospores. And then when everything is in balance, again, that's when we're able to actually increase any intensity if we need to.
Mm-hmm.
So the 3 key components that we bring into balance are the soil food web first and foremost. Those are our living organism check mark to tell us whether or not we're doing well. Are we achieving are we achieving the goal? Are they surviving? Are they thriving? Are they increasing in diversity and numbers? They're key to the system. And then the next part of the system is the mineral and nutrition part. So we're going to be talking about one component in that, the mineral part of that today. And then when those are in balance, it needs to be coupled with all of our cultural practices that support the soil food web and support balance in nutrition and minerals. So when we get all of those components right and in balance with each other, then we can have success in the system. Success in high yields, success in terpene profiles, success in the cannabinoid profile that you might be looking for. So that's the gist of what we're talking about today. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the same case study that we went into yesterday, specifically talking about the details of the mineral balancing today.
Mm-hmm.
So these are going to, if you've tuned in yesterday, these will be some familiar photos for you.
And if you haven't tuned into yesterday's stream, you should check that out. So again, we're working with a commercial regulated farm in the state of California. It's extremely difficult to navigate those regulations. This particular farm is 10,000 square foot of canopy. They had to expand from previous years. So greenhouses 1 through 4 had soil that was used on outdoor full-term pots in the years prior, and they were just remineralizing it in the way that they had done every year. When you look at the numbers, greenhouse 1 through 4 had 3 times the desirable nitrogen levels and essentially half the desirable calcium levels in greenhouses 5 through 7, which was a new purchased soil. Turned out to be a very low quality soil that was extremely problematic for the regulated space. What they did have going for them was an extremely solid crew. And we were able to coach them through this process, and on top of their exceptional ability to execute, had quite a solid outcome. So this is the day we started, which we never start midstream. Again, we started mid-harvest with this farm because of the quality of their crew. One of their employees had already gone through the Dr. Elaine Ingham Soil Food Web courses. He had already worked on other living soil farms and actually had worked with other farms that we had consulted with before. So we felt that we could jump in midstream on this one and still have good success. if you're a soil food web consultant that's following along, it's definitely not in anybody's best interest really to come in the middle of a harvest and try to be heroic. There's so many things that can go wrong when you start adding compost and biology to an active system midstream. Sometimes it can really get out of hand. And we've, as a business, typically taken the strategy to not do that and try to start at the beginning of the harvest cycle. With the level of experience we have now, we can kind of manage these things, but just kind of food for thought. It's something we don't typically do. Here you can see the trellis netting is quite sparse in some areas. This is week 1 of flower, so definitely far below the biomass levels that the farmer was expecting for this time period and was hoping for at this transitional stage. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Most of those trellis squares should be filled to hit your appropriate commercial yield. And now 2 weeks before harvest, you can see that we were able to fill out the greenhouses and get an appropriate commercial yield. So, the end result of the story was still good. This is an overhead canopy shot of greenhouse 5 through 7. I believe this is number 6. And you can see that bed 1 on the left there has already been harvested. The fantastic canopy management. I really like this picture. This is just sexy from my standpoint. The guy that was in charge of doing canopy management, I believe this is art. I mean, that's just beautiful in the commercial space to try and get 10,000 square foot of canopy, dead nuts, perfect level, which for those that are growing in the greenhouses, having an even canopy and consistent light penetration across your entire square footage is one of the main factors for maintaining yield. Here we have a side-by-side of the exact same genetics. On the left, we have the plant that was in soil 5 through 7, so not toxic nitrogen, still low calcium, but we were able to correct it to an acceptable degree, along with adjusting the weekly fertilization strategy. We were able to produce some extremely high quality cannabis. On the right side, this is the plants that was in the high nitrogen imbalanced soil. And there was a very clear variation in quality from the frost on the flower, the development of the flower, just the overall bag appeal, as they'd say. So very visual characteristic differences in the imbalanced soil, despite having the same exact crew, same exact greenhouse, same exact protocols, everything else being the same except for the chemistry in the soil. And I would say that this is an argument as to why soil chemistry is equally as important as soil biology, because we were able to execute the soil biology as directed by Dr. Lane Ingham, and it improved everything, but it did not overcome this significant difference in expression of the genetics. And here we have a side-by-side. So on the left is 5 through 7, on the right is 1 through 4, where the nitrogen was toxic. You can see just visually there's a lot more flower sites. The flower sites are larger, just completely different outcome with literally identical genetics. So when we approach soil balancing, we do like to use Logan Labs. I like to use Logan Labs because in the pre-legal era, we shall say, of cannabis, when it was medical and rather vague gray areas, Logan Labs treated us like adults. They treated us like professionals, and they responded just like any other customer. And I have a tremendous amount of appreciation for that, because as a cannabis grower, historically, if you even tried to call a soil lab and they got the slightest sniff that you were a cannabis farmer, they would hang up the phone on you. And so I'm a big proponent of supporting those that supported us during the time when nobody else would. On top of that, I feel Logan provides reliable results. There are some things here and there, like any business, where you see some typos or in error, but also what I like about Logan Labs is that if you feel that there's a problem with one of their reportings, they maintain the soil for a 2-week period. You just call them up and just ask them to rerun the test and clarify what you think is an obstacle. Sometimes they rerun just a single number. Sometimes they rerun the entire test, but I think that's a pretty nice service by a lab business. So from my understanding, this Malic 3 test, which we refer to as the M3 because nobody can spell Malic, myself included, and to my understanding, it was developed by Dr. William Albrecht, and he was on a mission to develop rhizobacteria for soybeans to create nodules. What he found was they were having a hard time finding species to inoculate the root zone. And what he determined that it was a fertility issue. It wasn't a bacteria issue, it was a fertility issue. And he was able to then develop soil testing procedures to quantify that soil chemistry and determine that it was in fact a nutritional issue as to why the nodules of the soybeans or whatever it was were not being inoculated. The M3 test uses a harsher extract acid, and it is intended to show the total nutrient pool in the soil. So it's like the totality of the bank account versus what's in your pocket. Dr. Albrecht had three basic principles that after this process he felt were extremely important. One was we need to maintain carbon at all costs, which is a correlation to the organic matter. And at the time, during the peak of the Green Revolution and the application of soluble synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, he was literally quantifying the soil vaporizing into the air from excessive nitrogen, which accelerates the decomposition of carbon. Dr. Albrecht also believed that you should start with the biggest deficit, which I would term as starting with balance. And obviously starting with that is which is most lacking, which also falls in line with the von Liebig principle of the law of minimum, where the yield is impacted by the first thing to run out. Albrecht was a big advocate of this base saturation percentage consideration and adjusting trace minerals. In regards to trace minerals, of all the things that we do for farms that provide a shocking result of positive outcome, adding basic levels of trace minerals in balance usually is right up there with the extremely profound benefits that come from using a biologically complete compost. So I think especially in the living soil community, there's almost a complete and total neglect of trace minerals. And if you just simply add what needs to be in there, really remarkable things start to happen. And Dr. Albrecht also was a big advocate that excessive nitrogen over the calcium needs of the soil causes a fermentation in the soil. So calcium is what flocculates the soil, or what allows healthy air penetration and flocculation of that soil. So when the farmer goes with an NPK strategy disregarding calcium, it actually continues to decrease the oxygen in the soil, compact it further, making it harder for nutrients to get, or harder for the roots to get to the nutrients, and also turning it anaerobic, which is exactly the considerations of the soil tests I'm going to share today. In addition to the M3, if you get the complete set of tests, which we always advocate, Logan Labs also provides the saturated paste test. Saturated paste test, I'm not sure who exactly created it, if it was a university or a single individual. I became familiar of it from Dr. Carey Reams, who Dr. Carey Reams, to my understanding, at least worked casually with Dr. Albrecht during the same periods. Carey Reams was also the mentor to Arden Anderson, Dr. Arden Anderson, who was the mentor to John Kempf. So a lot of people don't realize that a lot of what they're following are coming from Dr. Carey Reams as well. Dr. Carey Reams did do slight variations to the Malic 3 and the saturated paste, so he used like a Morgan extraction agent, which is a slightly less harsh acid extraction agent than the Malic 3 test uses, and then ultimately moved to deionized water for the saturated paste test. The saturated paste test is also very popular in certain circles. A lot of cannabis farmers that get into soil testing, they pretty much live and die by the saturated paste test. So they use a strategy to analyze the soil every 2 weeks, and they're making corrections every 2 weeks based on that soil test using sulfate minerals. That is a strategy that can get results. It's not my preferred strategy. And typically the farms that hire us are not interested in just dumping on sulfates and calling it biological farming. So we do veer from a lot of the people in cannabis that do get into soil testing, and we believe that you should aim for the corrections of the Malic 3 with the considerations for the saturated paste and work with them together. If you are only managing the saturated paste test and you actually add a full soil food web and a biologically complete compost, and you're not managing the Malic 3 or the total nutrient pool, you will run it out. And so typically the people that are living and dying by the saturated paste test are relying on like a single bacteria source like EM1 or a packaged bacterial product, which is a long way from what we believe in. So like I said, the saturated paste test uses a weaker acid, in its attempt to simulate what is currently available to the plant roots, or what the roots are surrounded by or saturated by. You can run this test. The lab's standard protocol is to use deionized water, or reverse osmosis water would be another name. And I think that's somewhat helpful, but in the living soil setting, you should really never be watering with reverse osmosis water. You should always be watering with something that has a basic level of minerality, at least 100, 150 parts per million, if not what we do, which is a full fertility balanced nutritional strategy. So I think if you really want to get the most out of this report, simply doing the deionized water, I find that, kind of marginally helpful. And I think you should really send in your source water. So if you're going to take this test, you should also include a water bottle with whatever water comes out of your faucet. So if it's well water or city water or some nutrient you're mixing up, I think that's going to be the most valuable. And I wanted to take a second to go over some soil test reports. And so this is from the same farm. And what we're looking at here is, bear with me, it's a little hard to get all this Logan data into some readable level on the internet. But nonetheless, you have this red line, and to the left of it is the preliminary testing we did on the first day of greenhouse 1 through 4. This first column here was greenhouse 2 that had extremely bad performance, so we isolated that to determine what the variable was. And on the right side of this line here is the follow-up test, which happened on September 23rd. So we've got roughly a month between the two tests. And starting right off, you can look at the exchange capacity of these first soil tests. You can see there's a significant difference between number 2 bad and number 1 or 2. What I think happened in this situation was when the farm was remineralizing the soil after moving it from their outdoor pots, whoever was in charge of adding the minerals gave a double dose to one of the beds, and the bed next to it got no dose. So you saw a doubling up of nutrients into one single bed, which really can make a lot of downstream problems. So looking at the exchange capacity of 1 through 4, they actually, for not doing soil testing, they did a pretty solid job of moving the soil and adding minerals and not throwing it completely out of whack. So it's at least something really positive. You can see that we had to increase that exchange capacity to a considerable degree in an effort to balance it. So the exchange capacity is a formula that reflects the basic cations, so calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. As you increase those 4 components, the exchange capacity naturally increases because it's a formula thereof. We've said many times that the goal is balance. So my first goal is to try to balance and make the individual greenhouses as consistent to each other as possible. I think in living soil, that's the number 1 goal for anybody that's cultivating. And so you can see there's a considerable variation in just the first levels here of sulfur. We got anywhere from 195 to 500. So I was actually pretty proud of myself to see that we dead nuts hit 600 pretty good. And for, what would be almost I guess like 7,000 square foot of greenhouse, we still got pretty dead nuts. We tightened up phosphorus quite a bit. And I think what's really important is to look at these base saturation levels. So the kind of basis of this Mehlich 3 test is balancing the base saturation. So we started out with 64, 60, 65, 62, and 66% calcium, which it really should be like 68 to maybe 72 in a potting soil aimed for cannabis. The big issue we've got here is the magnesium and the potassium levels are quite high. As magnesium starts to get really high, magnesium has a contracting force on the soil, and it will constrict that soil, make it less oxygenated and compacted. On top of that, it's a yield and quality killer in cannabis. So the first goal was to try and get these calcium levels up to the adequate level. If you read the works of Dr. Albrecht, he said that when they were separating the clay colloid to determine what a soil should be made of, so they spun it in a centrifuge and slung all the nutrients off and completely turned it into a clear Vaseline substance. They found out that you couldn't even grow a plant well until you had at least 65% base saturation in calcium. And I think that should be paid attention to. Some of the people in cannabis believe that this test is fairly unreliable because the information is so old. I think the issue is we just need to tailor it to cannabis. You can see the real issue down here. We've got 215, 250, 375 parts per million of nitrogen. Holy shit. That should be somewhere between 50 and 150. And the fun part about this one was the farmer was adding an NPK dry top dress. I believe it was Green Grow, which is a fantastic product. But the issue is that product doesn't maintain enough calcium to maintain the soil. So you're going to be increasing magnesium, you're going to be increasing potassium, you're going to be increasing nitrogen, but the ratios to calcium is going to fall off to shit. And so it was my advice to this farmer to not put any more on that product on greenhouse 1 through 4 for the rest of the season. For those of you that are going to be consultants, 10 out of 10 times the farmer is going to keep doing that. And you can see that he did here. So the thing I was really up against was trying to not go above any more nitrogen really at all. And you can see that damn near all of them got bumped to over 300, considerably making the final application. The horn tooting of myself was I still hit the targets knowing that he was going to do that. So my application of the amendments was also taking into consideration that he was 100% likely to be contributing another application. So here we have 5 through 7. And let me zoom in a little bit here. So same thing, we've got on the left, we've got August 19th of the preliminary test and a follow-up test in September. This one was a little bit harder to get close to each other because it was so remarkably out of whack. So you can see that the base saturation of calcium is at 51. They're all below 60. When calcium is below 60 on the base saturation, you can't use sulfur to increase that gypsum. You can't use gypsum to increase that base saturation because the calcium is so fragile in that soil solution that the sulfur will dislodge it. You can see that I still increased sulfur because I still had to put soluble calcium in there in the form of gypsum, knowing that it would not provide a very significant benefit to my base saturation, which you can see it did here. But regardless, it was something that we had to do. And then we made a long-term application of some slower release calcium in a hope to build that up over time. We added a little bit to the trace minerals, and you can see down here, we're actually in a nice place for nitrogen. So I try to maintain nitrogen between 50 and 150. So we did want an application of nitrogen, but not the Green Grow product. Again, he put it on here as well, and I had to calculate and account for that. But we at least got this one into the desirable ranges of 50 to 150. When we move to the saturated paste test, for those that are used to looking at these are kind of a hot mess. And we, in 30 days, we weren't able to make a really radical change to them. You can see that there's a considerable variation in the soluble salts, which is like the total nutrient pool consideration for this type of test. You can see that I did apply different levels of gypsum to each sample in an effort to get it, but you can see at least, we at least even some of these things out. So we took the consideration of how much gypsum to add in an effort to tighten up sulfur. We at least have good availability of phosphorus. The real issue is down here at the base saturations. On this test, you should be maybe 60, 20, and 12, something like that. And in a lot of situations, we've got potassium higher than calcium, damn near on the number at least. So this is pretty much upside down of what you want in a soil solution. 5 and 6, same type of thing. We've got an issue with pretty much everything, and we've got an issue with the same type of thing. So here we go, we got a hot mess. We got 46% base saturation of potassium and only 13% calcium. I think this is one of the most skiwampus soil tests I've seen on the saturated paste test. So not super good there. But so what we can do now is we can go to our soil test and we can show what that looks like. So this is the calculator tool that will be available to students that join the class. We have a place to put our calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium. I believe this was from sample 2. So you can see that we're a long way from 68 to 70%. You're well above the 12 to 15% magnesium, and we are significantly higher than we want to be in potassium, which should be maybe 4 to 9 or something like that. So all we do is come in here and start adding. And so I would typically drop down to the percentage increase calculator and see what a 40% increase does. So if we jump it to 40-25, we're still a long ass way from the goal, you know? So just for fun, we can type in and see what it would be. So 4,500 is not near enough. Notice how magnesium and potassium go down as we increase calcium. We're starting to get into the right range. 5,500, I mean, if I could get it 5,500, that would be suitable, maybe. Let's see what it takes to get it all the way to Albrecht balance, as they say. And that's about the best we can do with this soil sample from a base saturation standpoint to get it into that 68, 69, dropping it down to a reasonable level of magnesium. If we scroll down to our tool that helps us determine the percentage increase, and this is our starting value that was on the test. This is what it takes to balance it. That's a 126% increase of that value, or a difference of 3,600 parts per million, which is far more. That's something we're just not going to do. So, you know, hot mess for sure. And if we move over to our coursework, and this is what we're going to be talking about in our soil class. So during our soil class, we will be working through examples just like this on how to approach this problem. You know, enrollment is open now. We're going to be starting here pretty soon, and we will be available to answer all those questions. We got a couple questions here popping up. Sal's wondering, will cover crops like alfalfa help with nitrogen in the pots? If you were to put alfalfa into your soil pots, that's a perennial. When they typically grow alfalfa, it's a many-year process, and it can grow quite high. I would think for the purpose of production, any crop, alfalfa would be a really bad choice, in my opinion. So I would probably stay away from the alfalfa. If you top dress with alfalfa, you're likely to bring in a lot of glyphosate and a lot of toxicity issues. So alfalfa is not something that I would consider using for even a top dress. We recently had a farm that we've been working with for almost 2 years that got alfalfa chaff, which is like all the loose bits from the alfalfa bales, and it damn near put them out of business. We're still trying to figure out what happens. So alfalfa is probably the last thing I would try to incorporate into any system I'm working on, simply because alfalfa is just a really toxic crop from a glyphosate GMO standpoint. Most people don't understand that when you top dress with a high nitrogen, it's really problematic. So
Certainly can be.
yeah, what would you say would happen with a biological issue? So if we top dress a soil?
Yeah, so nitrogen is very stimulating to especially the bacterial populations. And so when you top dress with something like alfalfa, especially in any larger quantities, or what the bacteria would consider as a large quantity, is they get very excited and they start reproducing. When they start reproducing very fast in the soil, you get a bacterial bloom. As they reproduce, they use up that oxygen in the soil. So now you start going anaerobic. So it's a way that you can go quickly anaerobic in the soil. And also the other factor is that if you don't have the complete soil food web, let's say you're mostly bacteria dominant. When you bloom that bacteria and they're eating up and all the nutrients and things like that, and they don't have any predators to release that into the soil, they can tie up your nutrients very quickly. So now it can seem like it's not, you don't have as much of the nutrient release that you should be getting because there's no soil food web, the predator to prey interaction there to release that. I think that in one of Elaine's paper, she actually quantified that that particular phenomenon where they were able to quantify how much of the nutrients were actually tied up in less than a 24-hour period just by that bacterial bloom phenomenon. So there's a couple things that happen there with that kind of a consideration.
The big problem we see with regards to top dressing alfalfa hay, which in a lot of regions, if you go to the feed store and ask for a hay bale, they might give you alfalfa, which we wouldn't define alfalfa as hay. And so people get confused and they top dress it. Pretty much every time we've seen somebody top dress with an alfalfa hay, it gets hot, starts composting, and plant health goes to hell.
Yeah.
So just some considerations for alfalfa as an animal.
I've seen people use it at the end of an outdoor growing season where they've top dressed there, and then it snows and there's time for the bloom, the cycle to go through all of its things, boom and bust, and they were actually working with the soil food web. And so by the end of the 4 to 5, 6 month period of that winter time before spring, it had all those nuances of the soil food web. When you give it a stimulating food like that, can even out, and in that case it may be okay, but that's really, you can see that the interplay really took that long of a time to really even out and be appropriate to then start growing in. So
Sal's asking what would be a good cover crop to help with nitrogen, and this is one topic that we really diverge from a lot of the other people. So a lot of people really want to try and do clover cover crops. We've been saying since 2017 that's a real buggy problem in cannabis. The industry is starting to catch on. You're starting to hear other people, replicate the information that we're sharing. And so I wouldn't try to increase nitrogen through a cover crop personally.
right.
What I would try to do is I would try to encourage organism-to-organism interactions that cycle nitrogen,
Yes.
and then I would maintain nitrogen in the soil. That's how I would personally do it. So we tend to go with non-nitrogen fixing cover crops. Clover specifically is a cool season crop. In the context of our cannabis work, that's a warm season crop. So in nature, they wouldn't typically hang out at the same time of year. And visually, we see a tremendous amount of problems with mixing those two. So we tend to stick to non-nitrogen fixing perennials and a good mulch layer that increases nitrogen cycling rather, and mineralization and immobilization and all the other functions that the organisms do. So that's probably what I would personally do. If you're asking this question in regards to the context of this case study where there's excessive nitrogen, well, in that case, I would then try to maintain the carbon. So I would be adding carbon to balance that carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soil. That's what I would do. And then TC Cap here is asking, can the soil be balanced 1 to 2 weeks in flower? Yes, that's exactly what this case study we just shared showed, is that we came in on week 1 of flower, send in a soil test, and it came back a week later, and applied minerals during week 2 of flower and the last week of veg on 5 through 7. So you can certainly do that. Just the consideration is what minerals need to be added and what time period or life cycle phase is the plant in, and is that a good time to make a heavy application? So, heading into flower, you're typically looking at flowering nutrients, which would be more like potassium over calcium. In this situation, we just needed so much calcium, we were going to end up with a significant bug issue perpetuating if we did not address the calcium. So I typically wouldn't make such a heavy application of calcium, which is not necessarily a flowering nutrient, because if you put on a tremendous amount of calcium during the reproductive stage, you might inhibit the plant's ability to fill the flower properly. So in that situation, we managed it through other phenomenon. So we knew that we were adding a tremendous amount of calcium, which is not necessarily a flower filling nutrient. It's a frame size building and a plant health general cell foundational nutrient, but not something that's going to fill the flower and make density. So we compensated for that with our fertilization fertility. So I hope that makes sense. And shout out to, you're pretty dope too, in reality. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for tuning in. So Trail Boss wants to know, how does foliar feeding fulvic and humic acids from bioag affect the mineral balance? You want to handle that one, or at least from a stimulation standpoint, what does it do to biology?
So it turns out that the biology really respond very favorably to fulvic and humic acids. So it tends to be kind of like if you can think of it like a liquid circuit board, where it's produced by the biology itself, but because it has these chelating, these chemical little arms on it per se, it allows the microbes in the plant to be able to move and make available the nutrients to the plant and to the microbes. So there's a lot of interaction that happens with foliar feeding fulvic and humic acids that then make any nutrition coming from the microbes themselves, and also any nutrition that you then foliar apply on more available and much quicker. There's a product that we use that even accelerates that more, much quicker as well. So it can be a big boon to your farm, to your plants, any crop, not just cannabis, to use foliar feeding of fulvic and humic acids.
From a mineral chemistry standpoint, fulvic acid accelerates the uptake of phosphate, and most nutrients need phosphate to get into the plant. So by adding fulvic acid, you're accelerating the uptake of all nutrients.
Yeah.
So food for thought there. First in yesterday, last in today. Maybe next Wednesday you'll get it together. Smiley's Garden coming in hot. Smiley's going to be a guest coming up here on our podcast. We got to get in touch. Hit me up, brother. Yeah. And in reality, this is paradigm shifting. That's honestly one of the reasons why we've been so quiet. We do things radically different than what's said in the Living Soil community. Yeah. So but it's time to talk now. So here we come. Smiley's Garden. Some crops can have a reducing effect on soil, and some can have an oxidizing effect. So reducing would be beneficial in that you're taking large molecules and reducing them down into bite-sized pieces, where oxidizing would be a negative, would be not beneficial. What do you think about dichondra, fam?
Well, we love dichondra, I have to
Sarah's
say.
the originator of dichondra.
So we got started on dichondra back in 2015. That's when I did my training with Dr. Ingham up on her farm, and that's where I got exposed to dichondra as what she calls a cover plant. So what she really means is like a perennial companion plant. And so dichondra is great specifically for cannabis because it's appropriate to the context. We're just looking for living roots that supplement and fill the space without necessarily robbing anything from the cannabis plant at all, and not needing too much. It handles light, it handles shade. It will fill in the space pretty radically, so you'll end up, at the end of every harvest, probably thinning that back a lot. But you don't have to necessarily chop and drop during the harvest either, because it doesn't get high, or tall, where you have to do that like a grass or whatever. But it is just one species. So we do recommend moving to more species if you possibly can, if it's appropriate for your space and what you like. But even just getting 2 different plants in the system is better than just 1 plant in the system. So we will always say diversity is a good thing, and in cover crops, cover plants, that can be a boon to the system, but it needs to also be contextually appropriate. So that's why clover is really not contextually appropriate for cannabis that we've seen in any way. So, there's. Anyway,
I was to say, one thing we like about dichondra with the context of cannabis is it handles the high fertility. It doesn't seem to freak out. If you want to make a bug issue in your farm, then I would definitely feed clover high cannabis feeds, and it makes it buggy as hell. So we typically get it from Outside Pride. Outside Pride in particular has a coating on their seed that is not a fungicide. Dichondra is typically grown in shady, waterlogged soil areas, so they cover it with a fungicide so that it can survive in that environment. We don't necessarily want to be throwing fungicides into a regulated cannabis space, or really any of our gardens, that might lead to a test fail or kill things. So,
So that's why we use Outside Pride.
Yeah, so right on, man. Thanks for coming, Joe. And let's see, what's this? Are there any flower density nutrients or practices you can recommend? Well, our strategy is always knowing what you're doing. So we do water chemistry analysis. We do let me flatten this out here a little bit. Oh, I guess I locked it. Anyways, I'll get better at this. But we tend to know what you're doing with regards to feeding. So if you are having a flower density issue, that means typically there's either inadequate nutrition or an imbalance of nutrition. So there's not enough potassium for the ratio of calcium in the liquid feeds that you're given or in the soil. So in order to ensure proper flower density, we do a water chemistry analysis. You can do it through Logan. It's about $42. In the commercial space, it it leaves out a few trace minerals that have been problematic in our work. So it can be good enough for the home grower, but for some of our more aggressive clients, we use another lab in Southern California. They are happy to work with cannabis, but they're not super stoked on their name being put out there. They also work as a lab for other consultants. So consultants use them as a lab and then put their name on the report. So I don't like to blow that up, but hit us up and we can link you to who that is. We just don't want to do it, want to not step on anybody's toes. What do you think the nutrient profile of aged wood chip is? What do you think about that? It's mostly carbon.
Yeah, well, it's going to depend on the type of wood for one, but it's going to be very carbon heavy. So 60-to-1 is the narrowest ratio that you'll find in wood chips, basically. And so it just depends on what kind of wood chip that it is, and some of them are 500-to-1. But it is going to be a carbon heavy, wide C to N ratio is what we call it. This is your fungal foods. So yeah, lignin, cellulose, those kinds of things.
Yeah. What about rye as a cover crop? We just went through this with a farm. What do you think about that? Can get out of hand.
Yeah,
Real out of hand. We are advocates of using grasses. What we like to use is we get a mulch called tri-bale or three-way or tri-grain, depending on where you're at in the country is what they call it. But it's typically an off-season hay bale that's not fertilized, not pesticide, not fungicide. They don't really put much on it. They just grow it. A lot of times it's dry land farmed, so they're not even really watering it. And it comes with 3 different varieties in there. Typically, it seems to be oats, rye, and barley. Mm-hmm. And what's important is the seed head is included in that bale. I think that's an extreme benefit. Mm-hmm. And you can spread out the mulch layer, keep it moist, and you will also get
some of the sprouting seed heads.
The thing is, though, those become 4-foot tall grasses. So if you don't whop them off early before they start to really form a stalk, they can get way out of hand.
Yeah, and if that's not something that you want in your garden, then heads up to that, you know. Mm-hmm.
What's up, Daydream? Following the rules. We got a Q question here. So have you seen any papers on applying growing bacteria to sequester nitrogen in high-level soils? Where would we turn? That could maybe be something we could do on our Science Bro. Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. So, yeah, thank you, too. Thanks for helping out, Smiley, dropping answers in the comments. Yeah. Dichondra particularly, yep, it is a slow sprouter for sure. So having a hard time getting it to sprout. Some of that issue can be with moisture in the mulch layer. So if you're not maintaining a mulch, it's definitely going to be hard to get going. If you aren't keeping the soil surface moist enough, yeah, that can be a bit of an issue getting them to sprout. The other thing is timing. If you spread them out while your canopy is filling in, then there's just not enough light penetration. Mm-hmm. So they are fairly sensitive to shade, which is what we want. That's what kind of keeps it under control during the flowering cycle. So once the dichondra actually germinates and gets going, it's usually pretty permanent. It's almost kind of Bermuda grassy in that you got to like cut it out like sod to get it out. So that is the one caveat. You know, if you're new to dichondra, throw it in 1 or 2 pots or 1 or 2 beds, see if you like it before you put it anywhere. Some people don't like it. If you don't maintain a very dense canopy, then there's a lot of light going to the dichondra, especially in the indoor setting with the way the lights interlace. If you're maintaining a large canopy and a full canopy, it does die back reasonably well, and it kind of keeps it under control. So during the early weeks of veg, the dichondra has an opportunity to really take off, and then it starts to slowly die back during the flowering season or period, and then takes off again. Yeah. So right on. Well, we're right about an hour. I think we've kind of hit the goal for the day. Yeah. Again, we're going to be firing up again Wednesday.
Yeah. So hopefully you can see how, this mineral balance can interplay really well with the microbial component, making these nutrients available to your plants and in balance to your plants. So it can be done, and we're just trying to bring about maybe a new paradigm shift about working together. Yeah.
Yep. Here to change the game, fam. So again, thanks for tuning in. Oh yeah, I guess we should answer this before we go.
Yeah.
Dichondra repens is the one we normally get. There are a couple other. We've got a growers group member that's been experimenting with some of the other ones. Maybe we could do an episode on all the different versions that are being experimented with. Here's a good question, I guess. Do the calculator tools help us decide what amendments to add and how much of them to bring things into balance? And so if we go over to our calculator tool, it does have, sorry about that. Crap. Still new, bear with me. You gotta lock your screen. So it does have a component for calculating, but you need to enter it in. So you enter in the bulk density, you enter in the desired ppm increase, and then you enter the analysis, and it spits out what needs to go there. And what I've personally found is that with complete all-in-one tools, there's significant issues with balancing the soil with just a calculator that spits out a result. Maybe next week when we go over some of the soil test results, I can show you what an all-in-one calculator tool would spit out as a response. And what I found is that it takes a little bit of critical thinking on the side of the operator, the farmer, whoever's doing these calculations. And then what is really, I feel best, is having a tool that does the math for you so you can, mash the keypad, so to speak. So along with the calculator tool comes the analysis of all the amendments that you would use. We have a product-based business that will be selling all these amendments. And then in order to help the farmer, we're going to send those products in for analysis and then update the report sheet on what the actual calcium percentage is. So a lot of times gypsum will say 16% calcium, 22% sulfur, but it's a naturally mined product. It might vary by as much as 5 to 10%. So we're going to bring in a lot of gypsum and we're going to send it in for analysis, and then we're going to update it in the calculator tool. So that's just my preferred strategy based on somebody that had to figure out how to do this as a function of my job in the professional space, using the tools that were available, using the math calculators that were available, and then coming up with my own strategy. So in the course, I'm going to teach you and bring you up to speed with how to do this. And it seems overwhelming at first, and most people want an all-in-one tool. And I'm not gonna lie, I wanted that in the beginning too. I thought that's what you needed. I used some of the tools that were available and found that there was some issue with results, honestly. So if you can understand the foundational principles of where you are, where you need to go, and then you just have a calculator tool that helps you quickly perform the functions, you can actually, I feel, do the mineral analysis recommendation as quickly in just a calculator tool like I build into one that would do an all-in-one that is likely filled with a lot of errors. So maybe that's what we'll do next Saturday, is go over some common soil test results, and we'll punch them into the calculator that I use, and we'll punch them into some all-in-one tools that are available on the internet and see what the end result is. So again, thanks for coming in. Thanks for tuning. And we'll see y'all next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Smiley, hit me up. Let's get you on the show.